The story of the American Revolution does not begin with attacks or a musket shot. It begins with an identity. To understand the fury and the profound sense of betrayal that fueled the 1770s, one must first grasp who the American colonists were. More accurately, who they believed of themselves to be in the middle of the 18th century. They did not see themselves as Americans in a separate, national sense. They saw themselves as British subjects, and fiercely proud ones at that. They were inheritors of a hard-won British liberty, beneficiaries of the glorious Revolution of 1688, and subjects of a constitutional monarchy that they considered the most enlightened and freest form of government on earth. A gentleman farmer in Virginia, or a merchant in Boston, would have felt a deeper kinship with a peer in London than with the French-speaking Catholics of Quebec, or the Spanish in Florida. They celebrated the king's birthday, drank toasts to his health, and flew the Union Jack. Their culture, their laws, their language, and their political philosophy were all fundamentally British. In many ways, they saw themselves as more British than the British themselves pura, less corrupted by the cynicism and luxury of the old world, and more closely aligned with the true, radical principles of English liberty. This deeply felt British identity was paradoxically strengthened by the very distance that separated the colonies from the mother country. For over a century, Great Britain had practiced a policy of salutary neglect. Preoccupied with European wars and domestic turmoil, London had largely left the colonies to their own devices, allowing them to develop their own political institutions with a remarkable degree of autonomy. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses had been levying local taxes and passing local laws since 1619. In New England, the town meeting was the crucible of a vibrant, participatory local democracy. Colonists became accustomed to a level of self-governance that was unheard of elsewhere in the British Empire. They believed this was their right as Englishmen, a right enshrined in documents stretching back to the Magna Carta. They elected their own assemblies, paid taxes to those assemblies, and expected those taxes to be used for local purposes. This long-standing tradition of home rule created a powerful expectation that their liberties were not gifts from the crown, but inherent rights, and that the power to tax was inseparable from the power of direct, local representation. Layered on top of this political experience was the intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment. The ideas of European thinkers were not confined to dusty libraries. They were debated in taverns, published in pamphlets, and preached from pulpits. John Locke's theory of natural rights, the idea that all men possess an inherent right to life, liberty, and property, and that government is a social contract created to protect those rights as gospel. If a government violated that contract, Locke argued, the people had the right to alter or abolish it. The works of French philosopher Montesquieu, with his emphasis on the separation of powers, and the radical English Commonwealth men who warned ceaselessly against the dangers of unchecked government power and corruption, all found fertile ground in the American mind. This created a political culture that was uniquely suspicious of centralized authority and hypersensitive to any perceived infringement on personal liberty. By 1763, the American colonists had forged a unique identity. They were fiercely proud British subjects who were at the same time fiercely independent, accustomed to self-government, and armed with a potent political ideology, championed liberty above all else. They were loyal subjects, but their loyalty was conditional, based on the assumption that the unwritten rules of their relationship with Britain would never change. That assumption was about to be spectacularly and fatally wrong. Section 2. The Price of Empire. The French and Indian War's bitter aftermath. The event that irrevocably shattered the old colonial relationship was not an act of tyranny, but an act of triumph. Great Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War. From 1754 to 1763, this conflict, arguably the first true world war, saw Britain and France clash in a global struggle for imperial dominance, with battlefields stretching from India to the Caribbean and from Europe to the forests of the Ohio Valley. For the American colonies, the war was an existential struggle. The French and their Native American allies posed a direct threat to their westward expansion and their very security. The war brought British power to the continent on an unprecedented scale. Thousands of red-coated regulars arrived, fighting alongside colonial militia units. It was a crucible of shared experience. Colonists like a young George Washington gained their first real taste of military command and learned invaluable lessons about British military tactics and their weaknesses. The war also fostered a sense of intercolonial cooperation against a common enemy, laying a psychological groundwork for future unity. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, the result was a stunning British victory. France was ejected from North America entirely. Canada and all French territory east of the Mississippi River now belonged to the British Crown. The colonists rejoiced. The threat on their frontier was gone. The continent, it seemed, lay open for them. But victory came at a staggering cost. Great Britain had doubled its national debt in the course of the war, and the administration of the vast new territories acquired from France promised to be enormously expensive. A standing army of 10,000 British regulars would need to be stationed in North America to manage the new lands and prevent conflicts with Native American tribes. From the perspective of the British Parliament and the new king, George III, the situation was clear. The war had been fought and won largely for the benefit and security of the American colonies. It was therefore not only reasonable but just that the colonists should begin to pay their fair share for the administration and defense of this newly expanded empire. The era of cellular neglect was over. The time had come for London to assert control, to organize its empire along more efficient, centralized lines, and to raise revenue directly from the colonies. The first blow to colonial expectations came almost immediately with the proclamation of 1763. To prevent costly wars with native tribes, resentful of colonial encroachment a danger, highlighted by Pontiac's Rebellion, a violent pan-tribal uprising that erupted that same year, London drew a line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains and forbade any colonial settlement west of it. To the colonists, this was an act of stunning betrayal. They had fought and bled to win that very land, and now the crown was denying them the fruits of their victory. It felt like they were being caged in, treated not as partners in the empire, but as unruly subjects who needed to be managed. This was followed by a series of administrative and fiscal reforms under Prime Minister George Grenville. The Sugar Act of 1-7-64, while technically a tax cut on molasses, came with stricter enforcement mechanisms and was explicitly designed to raise revenue, not just regulate trade. Cases involving smuggling would now be tried in Vice Admiralty courts, which had no juries, a violation of a cherished right as Englishmen. The Currency Act forbade the colonies from issuing their own paper money, creating economic hardship. Each of these measures, while seemingly rational from London's perspective, was viewed in the colonies through the lens of their long-held traditions and their radical Whig ideology. They saw not efficiency, but a deliberate, calculated plot to strip them of their property and their liberty. The war that had secured British America from foreign threats had, ironically, created a new threat, one that came from Britain itself. The stage was set for the first great confrontation. If the proclamation of 1763 was a source of irritation, and the Sugar Act a cause for alarm, the Stamp Act of 1765 was a political thunderclap. It was the moment the abstract constitutional debate exploded into a full-blown colony-wide crisis. Unlike previous measures, which could be seen as regulations on external trade, the Stamp Act was a direct, internal tax levied, not by the colonists' own elected assemblies, but by a distant parliament in which they had no representation. The act required that a royal stamp be affixed to nearly all printed materials: newspapers, pamphlets, almanacs, legal documents, wills, diplomas, playing cards, and dice. It was a tax that affected every level of society, from the dock worker buying a deck of cards to the merchant signing a bill of lading to the lawyer filing a brief. It was a brilliantly efficient way to raise revenue, and from the British perspective, it was utterly mundane. A similar tax had existed in England for decades. But in the colonies, it was seen as a tyrannical overreach, a mortal threat to the core principles of colonial liberty. The colonial response was immediate, unified, and ferocious. The constitutional argument was articulated most famously by Patrick Henry in the Virginia House of Burgesses. In a fiery speech, he introduced a series of resolves declaring that Virginians possessed all the rights of Englishmen, and that only their own assembly had the right to tax them. His speech reportedly ended with a treasonous-sounding warning. Caesar had is Brutus, Charles I is Cromwell, and George III may profit by their example. In Massachusetts, a more organized, radical opposition emerged. A group of artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, took the fight to the streets. Led by figures like the fiery political organizer Samuel Adams, they used intimidation and direct action to render the act unenforceable. They hung an effigy of the appointed stamp distributor, Andrew Oliver, from a large elm tree that would become known as the Liberty Tree. That night, a mob tore down a building Oliver owned and ransacked his home, terrified. Oliver resigned his commission. The mob then turned its attention to the home of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a symbol of royal authority, gutting his mansion and destroying his priceless library. The violence shocked many, but it was incredibly effective. By the time the Stamp Act was due to go into effect, every single appointed stamp distributor in the colonies had been forced to resign. Beyond the mob action, the crisis fostered a new level of formal and in October 1765, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York City for the Stamp Act Congress. This was a landmark event. They drafted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, a respectful but firm petition to the King and Parliament, asserting that taxation without representation was a violation of their fundamental rights. At the same time, colonial merchants organized a powerful economic weapon, a non-importation agreement, a boycott of British goods. This boycott hit British merchants and manufacturers hard, creating powerful advocates for repeal within Britain itself. Faced with an unenforceable law, widespread civil disobedience, and intense economic pressure at home, Parliament had no choice. In March 1766, they repealed the Stamp Act. The colonies erupted in celebration. With bells ringing and statues of King George III being erected, the crisis seemed to be over. But in their moment of victory, most colonists overlooked a crucial, ominous detail. On the very same day they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. This act asserted, in the clearest possible terms, that Parliament had the full power and authority to make laws and statutes to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The colonists had won the battle over the Stamp Act, but the British government had just declared its absolute sovereignty over them. The fundamental constitutional question remained unresolved. The stage was not cleared. It was merely being set for the next, more dangerous act. This chapter will detail the British government's next attempt to assert its authority and raise revenue. It will focus on the Townshend Acts of 1767, which place import duties on common goods like glass, lead, paper, and tea. The colonists saw this as another disguised tax, leading to a renewal of non-importation agreements. The narrative will center on Boston, which became the epicenter of resistance. We will explore the British decision to send troops to occupy the city in 1768, drastically raising tensions between soldiers and citizens. The section will build to the climactic and controversial event of March 5, 1770, the Boston Massacre. We will present a detailed, moment-by-moment account of the confrontation, exploring the confusion, fear, and anger that led a squad of British soldiers to fire on a civilian crowd, killing 5. The aftermath will be a key focus, the powerful propaganda victory for the Patriots, in the surprising trial where John Adams defended the soldiers, securing their acquittal in an act of principled legal defense. This section will explore the period of relative calm between 1770 and 1773. It will argue that this was not a period of reconciliation, but a crucial time of organization. With the repeal of most of the Townshend Acts, the non-importation movement collapsed and surface-level stability returned. However, radical leaders like Samuel Adams believed the threat to liberty remained. The focus of this chapter will be on Adams's creation of the Committees of Correspondence, first in Massachusetts, and then spreading throughout the colonies. This network of committees was the infrastructure of revolution. They were an underground government, sharing information, coordinating strategy, and shaping public opinion through pamphlets and circular letters. This section will show how these committees kept the spirit of resistance alive during a quiet period and created a unified political structure that could be rapidly mobilized when the next crisis inevitably arrived. This chapter details the event that pushed the colonies and Britain past the point of no return. It will begin with the Tea Act of 1773, a law designed not to tax the colonists, but to bail out the struggling British East India Company. The act actually made tea cheaper, but the colonists saw it as a Trojan horse, a trick to get them to accept the principle of parliamentary taxation. The narrative will build to the night of December 16, 1773, with a detailed account of the Boston Tea Party, when the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. The focus will then shift to the furious British reaction. Parliament passed a series of punitive laws known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. These acts closed the port of Boston, suspended the Massachusetts colonial government, allowed British officials to be tried in England, and instituted a new Quartering Act. This was no longer about taxation. It was about punishment and control, and it had the unintended effect of uniting the colonies in sympathy with This section will focus on the first unified political response to the Intolerable Acts. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. The narrative will explore the dynamic within the Congress, which included a wide spectrum of views. We will introduce key figures from different colonies: the radical Adams, cousins from the cautious Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania, who proposed a plan of union with Britain, and the eloquent Virginians, including Patrick Henry and George Washington. The chapter will detail their key decisions. They rejected Galloway's plan, issued a declaration of colonial rights, and, most importantly, created the Continental Association, a comprehensive, colony-wide boycott of all British goods. This section will emphasize that while they still professed loyalty to the king, they also called for the colonies to begin military preparations, a clear sign they were preparing for armed conflict if their demands were not met. This chapter will be a dramatic, blow-by-blow account of the first day of the Revolutionary War. April 19, 1775, the narrative will begin with the British. General Thomas Gage's secret plan to march from Boston to Concord to seize a hidden cache of colonial arms and ammunition. We will follow the Patriots' intelligence network, detailing Paul Revere's and William Dawes's famous midnight ride to warn the countryside. The story will build to the tense dawn standoff on Lexington Green between a small band of local militia and a formidable column of British regulars. We will explore the mystery of who fired the first shot that left 8 Americans dead. The focus will then shift to Concord, where the militia at the North Bridge offered organized resistance and fired back. The climax of the section will be the harrowing British retreat back to Boston, as they are harried and sniped at for 16 miles by thousands of militiamen from all over New England, turning a show of force into a bloody and humiliating ordeal. This section will cover the immediate aftermath of Lexington and as thousands of militia from across New England spontaneously gathered to besiege the British Army, trapping them in Boston. The narrative will focus on the first major, planned battle of the war, the Battle of Bunker Hill, on June 17, 1775. We will detail the colonial decision to fortify the heights overlooking Boston and the British decision to launch a frontal assault to dislodge them. The battle will be portrayed as a scene of incredible carnage, with the British regulars marching stoically into devastating waves of colonial musket fire. The famous command, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," will be explored. This chapter will detail the disastrous summer and fall of 1776, the lowest point of the war for the American cause. The narrative will begin with the massive British invasion of New York. A huge armada under the command of General William Howe and his brother, Admiral Richard Howe. We will describe the series of crushing defeats Washington's inexperienced army suffered in the Battle of Long Island and the subsequent loss of New York City. The focus will be on Washington's desperate, fighting retreat across New Jersey, pursued by the confident British Army. The morale of the Continental Army plummeted, enlistments were expiring, and the army was melting away through desertion. This section will paint a vivid picture of a revolution on the verge of complete collapse. Thomas Paine, witnessing the retreat, would write his famous words, "These are the times that try men's souls." This section will be a dramatic account of George Washington's daring gamble that saved the Revolution from extinction. The narrative will begin with the Continental Army huddled on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River in December 1776, defeated and freezing. We will detail Washington's audacious plan to cross the ice-choked river on Christmas night and launch a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. The crossing itself will be a centerpiece, highlighting the incredible hardship. The attack will be portrayed as a swift, stunning success that resulted in the capture of nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers with minimal American losses. Washington followed this up a week later with another bold stroke, evading the main British army under Cornwallis and attacking their rearguard at Princeton. These two small victories had an electrifying effect on American morale, restored faith in Washington's leadership, and convinced many soldiers they were the crucial turning point that ensured the war would continue. This chapter will focus on the campaign that is often considered the military turning point of the war. It will detail the complex British strategy for 1777, a three-pronged invasion designed to isolate New England by capturing control of the Hudson River Valley. The narrative will focus on the main thrust from Canada, led by the flamboyant British General John Burgoyne. We will follow his army's difficult journey south, bogged down by the wilderness and harried by American militia. The story will climax with the two battles of Saratoga, where an American army, under General Horatio Gates, decisively defeated and captured Burgoyne's entire army. The section will conclude by exploring the monumental diplomatic consequences of this victory. News of Saratoga convinced Francais, who had been secretly aiding the Americans, that the colonists had a real chance of winning. In 1778, Francais officially recognized the United States and signed a treaty of military alliance, transforming the colonial rebellion into a global war against Great Britain. This section will shift focus from the battlefield to the drawing rooms of Paris. The central character will be Benjamin Franklin, who served as the American ambassador to France. We will portray Franklin as a master of diplomacy and public relations, who skillfully played on French desires for revenge against Britain. He cultivated an image of himself as a rustic, virtuous American philosopher, which captivated French society. The narrative will explore the complex negotiations that led to the French alliance and the subsequent entry of Spain and the Netherlands into the war against Britain. This chapter will emphasize how the American Revolution became a world war, forcing Great Britain to defend its interests in the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and even India, stretching its military and financial resources to the breaking point. This global dimension was absolutely essential to the ultimate American victory. This chapter will be a deep dive into the brutal winter encampment at Valley Forge in 1777 to 78. The narrative will not just be a story of suffering of cold, starvation, and disease that killed nearly 2,500 soldiers, but also a story of profound transformation. We will explore the logistical crisis and the political infighting that left Washington's army so poorly supplied. The turning point of the chapter will be the arrival of a Prussian drill master, Baron Friedrich von Steuben. Though he was a fraud in some ways, he was a brilliant military trainer. We will detail how Steuben, speaking through translators, relentlessly drilled the ragged American soldiers, teaching them the fundamentals of European linear tactics, drill, and discipline. The section will conclude by showing how the Continental Army that marched out of Valley Forge in the spring was no longer a collection of militias, but a tougher, more professional, and more confident fighting force, capable of standing toe-to-toe with the British regulars. This chapter will explore the war's shift to the south, a phase that was far more brutal and complex than the fighting in the north. It will begin with the British Southern strategy, an attempt to rally the support of perceived loyalists in the south and restore royal control from the ground up. The narrative will cover the initial British successes, including the capture of Savannah and Charleston. The focus will then shift to the savage, partisan guerrilla war that erupted in the Carolina back. We will introduce figures like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and detail the brutal civil war that pitted neighbor against neighbor. The section will then follow the brilliant American general Nathaniel Greene, who took command of the shattered Southern Army. We will chronicle his masterful campaign of attrition, where he lost most of the battles, but won the strategic war by stretching the British Army under Lord Cornwallis to its breaking point, forcing them to abandon the Carolinas and march north into Virginia. This section will be an intimate, character-driven narrative, focusing on one of the most brilliant and tragic figures of the Revolution, Benedict Arnault. We will trace his career from his early heroism at battles like Saratoga, where he was a key architect of the victory, to his growing bitterness over a lack of recognition, political enemies, and mounting debt. The narrative will delve into the psychological and social factors that led him to commit treason. This chapter will be a detailed account of the decisive, final major battle of the Revolutionary War. The narrative will begin with Lord Cornwallis's fateful decision to march his British army to Yorktown, Virginia, a port where he hoped to be evacuated by the Royal Navy. We will then follow the masterful coordination between the American and French forces. The story will detail Washington's brilliant deception, making the British in New York think he was going to attack them, while he secretly marched his army hundreds of miles south to Virginia. The crucial element will be the arrival of the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, which drove off the British Navy in the Battle of the Chesapeake, trapping Cornwallis by sea. The section will then cover the siege of Yorktown, the relentless bombardment by American and French artillery, and the final, successful assault on key British. The climax will be the surrender of Cornwallis's entire army on October 19, 1781, as their bands reportedly played the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." This section will cover the messy and uncertain period between the victory at Yorktown and the official end of the war. While fighting had mostly ceased, the British still held New York City, and the nation was broke. The narrative will focus on two key threads. First, the complex diplomatic negotiations in Paris, led by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. We will show how they skillfully played the European powers against each other to secure not only British recognition of American independence but also incredibly generous territorial boundaries, extending the new nation to the Mississippi River. The second thread will be the domestic crises known as the Newburgh Conspiracy. We will detail the growing anger and frustration within the unpaid Continental Army, and a plot by some officers to march on Congress and potentially install a military dictatorship. The climax will be George Washington's dramatic, emotional address to his officers, where he quelled the rebellion through a masterful appeal to their honor and patriotism, single-handedly preventing the new republic from collapsing into military rule. The final chapter will serve as a powerful conclusion, arguing that the end of the war was not the end of the revolution. It will begin by exploring the failures of the Articles of Confederation, the nation's first government, which proved too weak to solve the country's crushing debt and social unrest, exemplified by Shays' Rebellion. This will lead to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, framed as a second political revolution designed to create a stronger, more stable republic. The narrative will touch on the great compromises of the convention, particularly over representation and slavery. The series will conclude by reflecting on the profound, and often tragic, contradictions of the revolution. It was a war for liberty that left hundreds of thousands of African Americans in bondage. It championed the rights of man while ignoring the rights of women. It secured a vast territory by dispossessing its Native American inhabitants. The forgotten memory, this series will argue, is that the revolution was not a single triumphant event, but the beginning of an ongoing, often painful struggle to live up to the high ideals proclaimed in 1776, a struggle that continues to define the American experience.